If you know someone who would love this story, share the video with them. The more we grow, the more amazing content we can bring to you. Let's build this community together. The hostel was an escape for Sarah, a quiet refuge where she could focus on her studies, away from her overbearing parents. It was a place where she could finally breathe and live on her terms. But the freedom came with its own set of challenges, particularly with Mr. Thomas, the warden. He was an older man, a quiet presence in the hostel, always observing from a distance. Sarah had never paid much attention to him, until one evening when she was late returning from the library. As she hurried past his office, she caught his gaze. It was lingering, unsettling. His eyes, always polite, now seemed to hold something else, a hidden desire that made her heart race. In the days that followed, Sarah began to notice more. His attention, once distant, grew more personal. He would stop her in the hallway, ask her how her studies were going, and sometimes even comment on how beautiful she looked in the sunlight. His compliments were subtle, but there was always an edge to them, an undertone that made her skin tingle uncomfortably. One night, after a late study session, Sarah found herself alone in the hostel's quiet common room. Finishing up her assignments, Mr. Thomas entered, as he often did, to make sure everything was in order. He lingered longer than usual, watching her with a calculating gaze. The air between them felt thick, charged. "You know," he said, his voice low, "you've got that special kind of focus. Not everyone has it." Sarah looked up at him, her stomach fluttering. "Thanks," she murmured, unsure of what to make of his words. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You don't know how many girls I've seen come and go here,"
he continued, his voice soft and persuasive.
"but there's something about you, something that makes you stand out." Sarah wanted to pull away, but she couldn't. His words were like a spell, slowly drawing her in. She didn't fully understand it, but she felt a strange pull towards him. Maybe it was the loneliness, the feeling of being away from home. Maybe it was the way his attention made her feel special, noticed in a way she never had been before. One evening, weeks later, Mr. Thomas asked Sarah to meet him in his office after the other students had gone to bed. She hesitated, but the curiosity inside her won. She found herself walking through the dark halls, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached his office, he was waiting, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice deep and low. "You and we have a connection. Don't you feel it?" Sarah tried to speak, but her throat felt dry, her voice barely a whisper. She nodded, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't just the words he was saying, but the way he looked at her, his eyes dark with intent. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was electric, sending a wave of warmth through her body. She wanted to pull away, to step back, but she couldn't move. The moment felt too powerful, too intense. Slowly, he moved closer, his hand trailing down her arm. "You're not like the others," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "You deserve more than this lonely life. I can show you a way out, a way to feel something real." Sarah's heart raced as he kissed her neck, his hands pulling her closer. His touch, his proximity, it felt wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. The desire, the need for something more than the quiet, controlled life she had, overtook her senses. In the dark of the hostel, as the night stretched on, Sarah gave in. She let herself be consumed by the moment, lost in the forbidden romance that was unfolding. It wasn't love, but something more dangerous, something thrilling. The next morning, the guilt settled in, but it was quickly replaced by a lingering sense of longing. Mr. Thomas, the warden, had crossed a line, but Sarah couldn't help the way her body responded to his presence. She knew she should stop it, but the affair had already begun, and she wasn't sure how to pull away from it now. The days after that first encounter were a blur for Sarah. Her life, which had always been organized and predictable, suddenly felt unpredictable and full of unanswered questions. She couldn't stop thinking about the warden, Mr. Thomas, and the way he had touched her, his presence lingering in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. The guilt came in waves, but so did a strange, thrilling sense of excitement. Every time they crossed paths, his gaze held a deeper intensity. A silent promise that twisted something inside her. It was almost as if he knew what she was feeling before she even did. She caught him watching her during meals, his eyes following her every move. And she felt a mix of unease and something darker, more magnetic. It was late one afternoon when Sarah received a note slipped under her door. Her hands trembled as she opened the small envelope, finding a handwritten message from Mr. Thomas. "Meet me at the back of the hostel tonight. No one will disturb us." Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she read the words. She knew she should ignore it, walk away, but something inside her, something she couldn't control, urged her to go. The night fell quickly, casting long shadows across the halls as she made her way toward the back of the hostel. When she arrived, Mr. Thomas was waiting just like he said he would be. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes dark and intent, locked onto hers as soon as she stepped into the dimly lit area. "You came?" he said softly, almost surprised, as though he'd expected her to hesitate, to fight against it. Sarah began, but her words faltered. What was she supposed to say? She wasn't even sure why she was there anymore. Without another word, Mr. Thomas stepped forward, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. His touch sent shivers down her spine, and for a moment, she forgot all the reasons why she shouldn't be there. He led her to a secluded spot, behind the hostel where the light barely touched the ground. The quiet of the night was broken only by the distant of the city and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. "You've been avoiding me," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I know what you're thinking. That this is wrong, that we should stop. But the truth is, Sarah, you've never felt this alive, have you?" She didn't respond immediately. He was right, in a way. She had never felt more alive, but also more terrified. Every moment with him was like stepping deeper into an unknown world, and she wasn't sure if she could find her way back. "You're special to me," he continued, his voice almost soothing. "I see something in you that no one else does, and I'll prove it to you." The words felt like a trap, like a promise of something that was both thrilling and dangerous.
He reached out again, his hand gently cupping her face.
His thumb brushed against her skin, and this time she didn't pull away. She couldn't. The tension between them was unbearable. "You're scared," he said softly, his lips brushing against her ear. "But I'll show you that fear isn't something to run from. It's something to embrace." Before she could think, before she could even stop herself, he kissed her softly at first, almost tenderly, as if testing her response. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat. For a moment she did nothing, just stood there in the darkness, caught in the web he was spinning. But then, as if some part of her had given in completely, she kissed him back. It wasn't like anything she had experienced before. It wasn't love, it was something far more dangerous. It was passion, raw and uncontrollable. The feeling of being wanted, of being desired, filled the emptiness she hadn't even known was there. He pulled her closer, his hands pressing against her back as his lips moved more urgently against hers. "You belong to me now," he whispered against her lips. The words sent a jolt of heat through her body, and for a moment she almost believed them. She was his. After that night, things shifted between them. Every glance, every whispered word from Mr. Thomas seemed to draw her in deeper. He was careful, always playing the game with calculated moves. When he saw Sarah in the common room, he would casually walk by, letting his fingers brush against hers, his eyes glinting with a knowing look. He would talk to her during meals, asking about her studies, her plans. But there was always a layer of something more beneath his words. He would give her little gifts, things she never expected, a book he knew she wanted, a piece of jewelry he said he had found while traveling. Each gift felt like a string tying her closer to him, each touch, like a thread weaving her deeper into his web. But he was clever. He never pushed too far, never forced her into anything. Instead, he used subtlety, waiting for her to come to him, for her to let down her guard. And she did. Every time she thought about ending it, every time she tried to pull away, He would do something small, something gentle to pull her back in. A look, a soft touch, a reminder of how alive she felt when she was with him. He knew her weaknesses, and he used them. When she was struggling with her studies, he would appear at her door, offering support. "I know how hard it can be," he'd say. "But you're strong. You can do this." His words were comforting, reassuring. But they were also manipulative. The lines between genuine care and calculated control blurred, and Sarah couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Weeks passed, and the affair between Sarah and Mr. Thomas became something she couldn't escape. She couldn't deny the attraction she felt for him, the pull that seemed to draw her back to him no matter how much she tried to resist. But in the back of her mind, she knew something wasn't right. She knew he was playing a game, and she was a pawn in it. One night, when Sarah found herself in Mr. Thomas's office once again, she noticed something strange. His desk was cluttered with papers, but there was one file that caught her eye. It was open, revealing something that made her blood run cold. It was a list of names. Her name was on it, along with several others. And beside each name, there were notes, details about each girl, things that only the warden would know. Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the truth. She wasn't the only one. There had been others before her. Mr. Thomas had been using the same tricks, the same manipulative behavior to trap them all, one by one. Panicked, Sarah tried to leave. But as she turned to go, Mr. Thomas appeared in the doorway. He was calm, his face unreadable. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said softly. "But now that you have, we both know there's no going back." The realization hit her like a wave. She had been played. She wasn't special, she was just another name on a list. But the worst part was, despite everything, she didn't know how to break free. Mr. Thomas stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "You're already in too deep, Sarah. You're mine now. And you'll never escape." The words hung in the air, suffocating her. She had fallen into his trap, and now there was no way out. The shock of discovering the list was almost too much for Sarah to process. Her chest tightened, her heart raced, and she felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal, though she had known deep down that something wasn't right. But the realization of being just another pawn in his game made her stomach churn. Mr. Thomas stood in the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. His calm demeanor only made her more anxious. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them until, "You didn't think I wouldn't notice, did you?" His voice was a soft whisper, a dangerous undertone laced in the words. "You've been suspicious. I could see it in your eyes, the way you pulled away every now and then. But don't worry," he added, his hand reaching out to gently brush a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's too late now." She wanted to step back, to run, but her feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His touch, though gentle, had an undeniable power over her. And she hated herself for still feeling the pull of his presence, for the way his every movement seemed to seep into her skin. "What's wrong with you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You use us play with our feelings, and for what? A sense of control?" He tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing with amusement. "Control? No, Sarah, this is much more than control. It's about connection. About showing you that you're capable of feeling something deeper, something that goes beyond the superficial. You think you can just walk away from that?" She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "You're sick." For a moment, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, hurt, maybe, or disappointment, but it was gone before she could fully process it. He gave a low, dark chuckle. "You're angry. I understand. But I've given you everything. Sarah, I've shown you a side of life, of passion, that you couldn't have experienced anywhere else. You should be grateful." Sarah took a step back, her thoughts spinning. He was delusional. He wasn't showing her anything good. He was manipulating her, trapping her in a twisted game. But the fear inside her kept her rooted to the spot, unsure how to escape the situation. "I'm not the first one, am I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His smile was small, almost sad, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his desk drawer. pulling out a piece of paper and handing it to her. "Here," he said softly. "You want to know the truth? There it is." She took the paper from him reluctantly, unfolding it to reveal a list of names. Her own name was at the top, but it wasn't just names. Next to each one, there were notes, descriptions, dates, and personal details that made her blood run cold. The names of other girls who had been in the hostel, all victims of his manipulation. Each one had been singled out, seduced, and then discarded when he was done with them. "How many, Mr. Thomas?" she asked, her voice cold and steady now, despite the trembling in her hands. "How many of us?" He didn't look at her. Instead, his eyes were focused on the wall behind her, as though he were lost in thought. "More than you can imagine," he said softly. "I never intended to hurt anyone. I just wanted to feel alive, to feel something real. And each of you gave me that." The way he said it made her shudder. He wasn't just manipulative. He was emotionally detached, incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. He viewed them all as objects, temporary distractions to satisfy his own desires. "Do you think you can just keep doing this?" Sarah spat, her anger rising, though it was mixed with fear. "Do you think you can just keep using people and get away with it?" Mr. Thomas finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm not getting away with anything," he said softly. "I have never hidden what I do. I've always been upfront with you, haven't I? All you had to do was accept it. But you wanted more, didn't you? You wanted love. Something real. But I can't give that to you." Her heart sank. "You never loved me." He shook his head slowly. "No, I never loved you, Sarah, but I gave you something just as important. I gave you passion. I gave you a reason to feel alive." She stared at him for a long moment, his words swirling around her mind. Part of her had known this all along, but hearing it from his lips made it undeniable. She had been a part of something twisted, and now there was no way out. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice firm, though her hands were still shaking. This is over. I'm going to tell someone." Mr. Thomas didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at her for a long moment, his eyes calculating. And then, just when she thought he would let her go, his expression changed. He smiled slowly, almost as if he were enjoying her discomfort. "You can try," he said softly, his tone dark and threatening. "But you're not going anywhere, Sarah. I'll make sure of that." She froze, the fear rushing back to her in waves. She couldn't let him scare her. She couldn't let him win. But deep down, she knew she was trapped. He had all the power. He knew all the secrets. He controlled the hostel, the other students, and even the faculty. She was just one more piece in his game. "I'll make you regret this," she whispered, her voice low and shaky. "I'll make sure you never do this to anyone again." He didn't seem fazed by her words. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the gap between them once more. His presence was overwhelming, suffocating. "You can't stop me," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "You never could." For a moment, they stood there in silence, the tension thick in the air. Sarah's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. But no matter how much she tried to rationalize, the truth was clear: she was stuck. And the longer she stayed, the harder it would be to escape. But she couldn't give up. Not now. "I'll fight you," she said, her voice more determined than before. "I will make sure this ends." Mr. Thomas looked at her with a mixture of amusement and something darker, something more sinister. "You'll try," he said softly. "But in the end, Sarah, you'll realize that you're just like the rest of them. You'll never be able to leave. Not when I'm the only one who can give you what you need."